Artificial intelligence is remaking marketing as we speak, and if you're a marketer, you can either get up to speed or get left behind. The choice is yours, and really, it's a no-brainer. Join Geoff Livingston and Greg Verdino as they explore the latest AI news, trends, tools, and ideas that are creating the future of marketing today. This is No Brainer, an AI podcast for marketers. Oh, and just in case you're wondering, yes, I am an AI. Take it away, Geoff and Greg.
Hi, I'm Greg Verdino, and this is No Brainer. I'm here with Geoff Livingston.
Hey, everybody.
How you doing today, Geoff?
Excellent. It's been a busy week in Washington, so excited to bring people up.
It's been a very busy week, interesting week in Washington, and that brings us, of course, to our topic. I know that we have, delved into regulation in bits and bobs and pieces and parts over the course of a number of different episodes, but it seems like this is the right time to really dig in deeper and really have an episode about regulation. And, we'll say that neither of us is an attorney, so none of this constitutes legal advice. However, do your own research, as the folks who were former Web3 experts would say. This is, I think, in many ways, relevant for marketers, either now or at some point down the road. You certainly do need to be aware of what the evolving regulatory landscape looks like, because at the end of the day, you're going to be expected to comply with it, right? So whether it's new laws or regulations or guidelines, at the end of the day, you're going to have to live with them. And if you're a global brand, you have this, the added complexity of different regulations in different countries. But even if you're here in the United States, we know, certainly we're going to talk a lot about the national conversation that's happening around regulation. But we also know that the states are all looking at different ways to regulate AI just for themselves. So I think there's going to be a lot of complexity to think through. And I think it is important for a marketer in these early days to really begin to understand how the conversation is shaping up. I think the other thing that's going on is, as a brand, because the conversation is still shaping up, it seems to me like you need to make a decision as to whether you're going to wait and see what happens and kind of follow along and do what you need to do, or if you're kind of going to get ahead of it and almost in a way regulate yourself, not obviously from a legal perspective, but from the perspective of making sort of smarter, more strategic choices and kind of trying to do the right thing from the outset so that you don't get caught on the back end when regulation catches up to you. So we're going to get into this in a big way. Before we do, as usual, we'd like to remind anybody who's watching or listening to follow, to like, to rate, to review, to do all those good things that help us feel good about ourselves, because of course that is important, but also to help others find our content and to, kind of goose the algorithms and do all the good things that ratings and likes and reviews and follows and flakes and flops and flutes and X's and whatever do for social media content creators like us. So with all of that good stuff out of the way, Geoff, why don't we dive right in? I know you are much closer to the Beltway than I am. So why don't you bring us into the world of Mr. AI as he heads to Washington?
Ooh, like that little riff there. Yeah, it's been an interesting week. I've attended a couple of private events and participated in one as a panelist. And what's happened, folks, for those of you that may not have been paying attention to the general trades and the news media, is that every major technologist that's involved in AI testified before Congress this week, from Elon and Sam to they brought Bill Gates out, Google, a couple of other ones like the CEO of Hugging Face, and gave their point of view on regulation, and almost every single one of them asked. But it's part of a larger initiative where Congress is gearing up to basically formulate some sort of opinion and regulation. It seems one of these rare things that has bipartisan support, where everybody wants to do something because nobody wants it to be as bad as social media was and the exploitation and some of the questionable things that have happened with freedom of speech and that kind of thing. And then on top of that, the Biden administration had a bunch of the different agencies come out and detail what they're doing or make policy announcements this week. And then several vendors also did a little bit of a kowtow, announced special ethical AI programs like Google's $20 million deal. And so it was a very busy week in Washington. And I think maybe if I was somebody that's not here, one of the questions I would ask is like, why is this such a big deal? And why does it seem to happen every 3 or 4 months? And the answer is money. There's a lot of business that's to be held here. These contracts that Microsoft, Google, and Amazon own through their cloud servers. I mean, you're talking billions and billions of dollars every year, and it's agency by agency. So it's a lot of money. And then, of course, the AI vendors have a lot to gain from it. But on top of it, too, there's the whole Europe versus US context that's going on. So, 15 companies agreed to voluntary safety and security standards for their AI tools, including third-party testing. There's a lot of posturing. There was Sam Altman's Nothing Burger, which I think I sent you an article and you sent it to me. It was like, hey, we all have a vested interest in this. And the question is what is that interest? Is it to stop everybody else from innovating? I think was the joke you had made.
That's right. That's one of the many things that goes through my mind, not to be skeptical or cynical about it, but, it's interesting to me to see the extent to which the companies that are creating the product that needs to be regulated seem to be setting the agenda for regulation. And I understand, of course, that politicians need to understand the technology itself and the way the technology works. And we know for a fact that our Congress people are not particularly good at understanding technology, from that whole Zuckerberg hearing where essentially the questioning amounted to what is a Facebook? And, and it was apparent that even the aides who were supporting the Congress people were doing the Congress people a disservice by not properly educating them. So I can see why someone like a Chuck Schumer, who chaired one of these meetings this week, would want to bring in Elon and Zuckerberg and Altman and whomever else. But when you're getting your education about sort of the risks, the harms, the realities, the myths, the hype, all of that is coming from the companies who stand the most to gain, the biggest tech giants in the world who are making the foundation models and are in this race to win. And they're sitting there telling you, here's what regulation should look like. Oh, don't listen to that little guy over there. Listen to us. It just seems like there's something off.
It's a bunch of elites telling the rest of us how AI should go. And if you think about it, the European form of regulation is really about protecting people, protecting data, protecting intellectual property. Right. And data and intellectual property were not part of the conversation.
Right, exactly. That should tell you something. And the other thing about the European regulation, whether you like this approach or not, it seems like a sensible approach. It is a risk-based approach. And I think there are some drawbacks to that. But what that means essentially for anybody who hasn't been following this is they've essentially set a set of tiers based on the amount of risk a given use of artificial intelligence might present in the real world. And the higher the level of risk, the tighter the regulation. So, for example, and this is maybe good news for marketers, but also a head scratcher for marketers who have been around a while. Something like if AI is being used to, for example, power an autonomous vehicle, and that autonomous vehicle obviously could wreak a lot of havoc if that AI went haywire in the middle of Leicester Square in London and just plowed through a bunch of people, that might be heavily regulated. If the AI is being used to write email marketing copy, that's a lesser risk and might be treated at a lower or a looser regulatory standard. Now, that sounds sensible on paper, And it also means certainly a lot of the work we do would be less subject to onerous requirements. But then you think back to the early days of social media when we all thought it was sunshine and roses and dogs on skateboards. And when we know now, 20 years later, all of the harms that social has caused inadvertently in many cases, right? I never thought that by advising my clients to use social media that I would in some way be partially complicit in all of this stuff that's going on now in terms of loneliness and depression and
Sure.
suicide and body image issues and all this.
And by the way, I do feel like a small little smidget, a thimble of guilt and regret about how much of an advocate I was about that. I mean, I kind of look back at it and I'm like, boy, I really thought it was a bit of a panacea. I definitely had my little Shangri-La on.
We were very, I don't know what the right term is, but certainly, we had our rose-colored glasses on. And I remember being annoyed when my book came out. It was reviewed in Publishers Weekly, and it was mostly a positive review. But the one dig the reviewer made, it was like something to the effect of, it's almost as if it never occurred to Verdino that people could interact for any reason other than commercial intent or something like that. And I'm like, well, it's a marketing book, so it's about how to use these tools for commercial intent. But that aside, I'm thinking,
you email them and say, "Don't you know who I am?"
Yeah, I did. And they said, actually, no. Did we review your book? But my point being, I took that as a dig at the time, which I think it kind of was a dig, and was like, how dare they? But now I think back and I'm like, how dare I? Right? I totally blew right past what would have made social important and powerful and turned it into, hey, brands, here's how you make your money. So you do feel a little bit of that responsibility, and we're going a little bit off topic in our little sort of pity party, but
bringing it back to AI a little bit, I mean, what you're talking about is people and base nature, right? And we all know that humans are animals at our core. I mean, we're mammals, literally, and we have instincts. And sometimes when those instincts go awry or unchecked, bad things happen. Yeah. And history is littered with lessons of it. So is the Daily News.
Yeah. And right. And, as it relates to the European regulations with those sort of 4 tiers of risk or whatever, if marketing is sneaking in at the lowest level of risk, nobody's thinking about.
And marketers are the slimiest people.
Absolutely. So then there's obviously other ways to regulate, but it's interesting because I'm not sure where we're going to go here in the States, whether we're going to do a risk-based thing or a precautionary thing. Or
I have a pretty good idea after this week. I have a gentleman's bet on where we are going to end up, but go ahead.
Are you willing to share?
I will share, I promise, but I want you to finish your thought.
No, I think I had no thought. I just had words.
It's Friday. We're recording on Friday, folks. So, it's really kind of interesting. To your point, let me just wrap up the AI tie there, is the way I see what you're saying. When you have human intent behind an algorithm and then that intent gets automated, multiplied exponentially, dramatic exponentials, tenfold, thousandfold, millionfold the speed of execution, that can be really dangerous if the AI the model perhaps acts in a way that nobody expected it to. And we've seen that in instances where the model will pick up on the data that it's being fed and go awry. So there's reason for the fear. And it does make sense based on the sense of application. So Europe's an interesting case. My feeling is in the United States, particularly, I would say generally our government is more conservative than European governments, even with the more liberal voices in the government. And think that's because we're more of a capitalistic society. And on top of that, I think that what's happened here is to get consensus and have action, it's going to be a pretty neutered bill. And I think what it's going to be is more like guardrails, maybe some basic privacy laws, like you can't use AI to surveil on people, surveillance, police state kind of stuff. But other than that, I question how much of it's going to get into actual legislation. And then the real big question is whether we're going to create another agency to be the AI regulatory authority, or if they're going to delegate it to FTC, which has become quite just so people don't know this, but the FTC's got 5 commissioners. I just learned this today from the panel I was on. And the 2 Republican commissioners have quit. So now the FTC is steering extremely left and then having all of its cases shot down in court, which is bad. So FTC is probably not the place. FCC could be the place. The SEC is definitely getting involved a little more. So there are all sorts of places that could host this. So there's a lot to figure out, but a lot of it's going to be nothing and just basically a kind of a pat on the back to Silicon Valley to keep developing.
Yeah, and I want to react to sort of what you were saying about the agencies. It's interesting because on the one hand, you might argue that something so new and of such import might require dedicated focus and expertise. On the other hand, you can argue, and that would argue in favor of an agency, right? And then on the other hand, when you think about how far reaching this is, and I think this is even a conversation that I often have with marketers, that this is not like adding a channel to your media plan, right? This is something that's going to get embedded into virtually everything you do. It's going to shape your strategy. It's going to be part of your creative production process. It's going to influence your distribution plan. It's going to help you optimize. It's going to be used internally for knowledge sharing and productivity. It's going to get baked into everything. And we're seeing that even technologically, right? Where you're seeing it baked into HubSpot and Salesforce and Adobe. Firefly is now out in the wild. I've not played with it, but
it's out of beta. It's out of beta.
It's out of beta, and it's free apparently to people who have the applications.
Yeah.
So we're seeing it getting baked into everything, getting baked into Google's productivity suite and Office, and it's getting baked.
By the way, have you used Google recently with Bard integrated in?
Yes,
it's. I'm going to say that it's actually pretty good.
Yeah,
it's actually pretty good.
Yeah,
I'm pretty impressed.
Not bad at all for the state of kind of early state of where it is. It actually is pretty good, and it is eye-opening to the extent that you now see in stark relief. This has nothing to do with regulation, but you now see in stark relief how good a narrative response can be and how few sources are cited in that narrative response. And you start to think about the implications for all of the blue links that lie beneath that are no longer necessary, that you've spent years, if not more, optimizing all your content to get onto that first page that's now pushed way down. And it's a totally different animal, right?
Right.
You still need to be authoritative in the hopes of getting into that generative AI response. But the number of organizations that are going to be able to achieve that, I think is going to be a fraction of the number of organizations that find themselves in Google's first page rankings.
Right. I would agree with that in large part because of their marketing and as opposed to trying to actually truly serve their audience with useful information, which great content marketers like Greg Verdino do.
and frankly, us, in our, as we are great content creators, at least that's what I tell myself that it's, and the 3 people who listen may or may not agree.
They're vomiting as we suck up to each other on the podcast.
And to be honest, when I say the 3 people who listen, it's me, it's Geoff, and some other person that we don't know.
Lisa Norell, who's waiting for me to drop the F-bomb.
All right. But
it's coming, Lisa. Stay tuned. I haven't done it yet, but it's coming.
I've now totally lost my train of thought. Oh,
so we were talking about.
Oh, right. Yeah. But then when it gets baked into everything, you would almost argue every agency needs to understand how to regulate and monitor and enforce AI-related guardrails relative to the thing they're expert in, whether they're expert in aviation or communication or commerce, right? So there's like a couple of different ways that could go, and who knows which way it'll go. I'm sure we'll pick the wrong way and then regret it. But we'll see. My biggest concern, I mean, not my biggest concern, and going back to what I said earlier, but it's definitely a big concern, is how the agenda gets set and what gets put into that agenda. Like you said, sort of intellectual property, content rights, things like that haven't even been part of this week's discussion.
Which is terrible. To me, that is the discussion, because when you get to AI, it's really a data game. I mean, I think everybody that's in the business knows this. It's garbage in, garbage out the whole way. We just talked about it with Google. We'll talk about it with your private instance. We'll talk about it with what your marketing team is putting in. It's always about what you're feeding the engine, because the AI in the end is just a program. And so all this conversation about, boy, we got to stop AI from doing this or that. Boy, maybe you should think about what you're feeding it to make sure it does it well, right? Yeah. On top of the uses. I mean, we have to stop police states and things like that. And I'm not belittling that.
No, that's important stuff too.
Right.
That's important to a marketer, but that is important.
A police state begins, like, for example, I gave this example on the panel I was on today. So, I live in Virginia, and people that know me know that my kid is LGBTQ plus, right? And identifies in that community. They're 12. We support the kid. We're not doing any physical things with them. We're letting them explore their teenage years naturally, but we are 100% behind them. The state, or the Commonwealth, of Virginia asked all parents to identify their LGBTQ plus children on a list for their school. And so that's an extremely damning data point if somebody wanted to abuse that data point to persecute, right, which is something that has happened throughout history. Hi, I'm Jewish. I don't want to bring up that whole bit. We all know what happened in World War II. But each genocide, each instance of civil rights abuse that we've experienced, even in this country, has been about one type of person against another. And as soon as you separate somebody as being within a different community, you set them up for this type of thing. And to me, putting a digital list together of how people see themselves or choose to be in their personal lives, I mean, it's extraordinarily dangerous. And that's what I mean by we have to protect data. I mean, this is the kind of data that's really should be nobody's business.
Right.
And here we have governments getting involved in it. And to me, that's what I'd like to see the regulatory environment address. And then the second part of that is one we've discussed a lot here, which is the value of data. How are you going to protect people's data so it's valued? And that includes organizations and entities that create data as part of their professional existence.
Right. And
that could be content.
Think
right?
about, that's content. That's, think about, like, I'm sure beyond the shadow of a doubt that, the Nike swoosh appears in the training data for every image generator zillions of times, because that product is so prevalent in world culture, right?
Sure.
So, right, what happens when that Nike swoosh starts showing up? And that's a trivial example compared to like the persecution of an other, right? But to a marketer, it's like, what happens if you're a Nike marketer? What happens when your Nike swoosh shows up in a zillion places, and it's cropping up in McDonald's ads and all these things, and it's like without any compensation, without any contribution, without any attribution. There's a whole lot of complexity there, and that doesn't even get us into obviously Stephen King's books or your favorite Sarah Silverman or whatever. So there's all that stuff around how do you protect intellectual property? How do you restrict or protect in some way access to certain kinds of sensitive data? How do you prevent organizations from using that data in a way that is disallowed, so to speak? And how do you do all those things, quite frankly, when you flip it around, without impinging on people's right to free speech, right? So you've got that on the other. So it's complex, right?
Very.
But and then that goes back to the fact that, you've got, our government taking their cues from Elon Musk, the self-proclaimed free speech crusader who's, clearly not a free speech crusader when you think about the way he is, even, I think there was a story today, throttling access to competitive social media content and, kind of banning people who speak out against him and all this weird stuff. And he's, it's like, that's the guy you're talking to about what AI should be and could be and will be.
Right. The very same guy that shows up to that panel and says we're all going to die because of AI.
Well, I was just going to say the exact same thing is, you look at who's in the room, it's him, you've got Zuckerberg, you've got Sam Altman, whatever, right? You've got all these people in the room who are talking about existential threats, right? It's all the, it's all the AI.
It's the drama queens.
Right. It's the doomers, so now, to what extent are we going to be putting regulation together to prevent sort of existential threats, which it's not a bad idea to say, like, we can't use AI to control autonomous weapons, or we can't use AI to do X, Y, or Z that would create an existential threat. However,
right. But then you're regulating the military, and people are talking about that. Notice that's not talked about.
That, right? And you're also regulating a theoretical or hypothetical future, much more so than you're regulating the real present day harms, which range from the kinds of things we've been talking about with IP and data and whatnot, down to whether or not an AI system is inadvertently giving black people greater, higher bail amounts than white people, or longer prison sentences than white people, or whatever, right? Because that's happening every day.
Sure. Or the use of, and this came up in one of these panels, so the use of AI and HR to disqualify people wholesale. 80% of U.S. HR departments, 80% of all jobs are basically filtered through HR. And, it includes those video interviews where they're doing facial tics, nervousness, reactions to the eyes, tonality, the whole 9 yards. I mean, it's just really, wow.
Yeah. And
pretty intense.
And it's interesting. I mean, this is more complexity, and it's not about the regulation, but about the use cases. I know a lot of these times, you've got these AI systems that are being used for screening resumes, and they might be, let's say, race blind, or they might be gender blind. And I'm going to put air quotes around those, right? So like the name might be removed, or if somebody makes references to being black, it might be removed. But you can't remove Howard University because that's their education, or you can't remove that they were in a sorority because that's part of their personal interests and history or whatever, right? If they had a leadership position in a sorority, that might show up in a resume for a young candidate. Not if you're like 48 years old and you still have your college like sorority activities and stuff.
I saw your sorority when I looked at your LinkedIn profile.
Well, I'm a little bit different. I like to be a completist, but you know what I'm saying? Like it's like that same.
You're a Tridel all the way.
Yeah, there was that old, like, not even AI, but it's coming to life in AI. That old example of, like, I don't know if it was the Boston Pops, but some major orchestra, in order to weed gender bias out, because the orchestra historically was essentially choosing predominantly male musicians for the orchestra. They wanted to weed out the gender bias. So they had the people who were auditioning, the musicians who were audition behind a screen, so they couldn't be seen. But the evaluators could hear like the tick, tick, tick of high heels as women entered the room to audition.
Right.
So it was like these secondary things that could still tip them off. So they ended up, it's like the whole that now everyone entered barefoot and blah, 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 blah.
Oh my God.
But the same kind of thing is happening with AI, where you might say, let's disinclude this type of biasing information, but there's no way to remove a lot of the secondary stuff that an AI is going to pick up on anyway.
Just like that Target mailer where they figured out the girl was pregnant, right?
Yeah.
And just started sending them just based off of her shopping behavior.
Right.
And that's the other thing is predictive analytics have gotten to that point now where they're smarter than human.
Yeah.
And so meaning that there's just enough tells that the data points are more
But that's
accurate
what
than
it
a
is.
human
They're
guess.
better. Any of these AIs, I mean, they're pattern prediction machines, right? So,
Right.
they're able to pick out patterns in a massive, massive amount of data that we would never see with the naked eye. And that's what makes them powerful, right? That's what makes a large language model work is it's got so much language in it that it's able to fairly reliably predict that if, somebody, if I write this word, this word, this word, the most likely next word is this. Right? That's how it works. And it just, same thing with an image generator. The most likely next pixel is this. And certainly when it comes down to predictive analytics in traditional AI, reams and reams of data where you or I would just go like, bleary eyed, right? We would never be able to pick out a pattern in somebody's shopping behavior the way an AI could. But they do, it happens, and then you end up with the issue. Which, if you're not familiar with it, it was years and years ago, I think, that Target sent a pregnancy mailer to a teenage girl, outing her in effect to her parents who did not know she was pregnant. And the dad called up Target irate. How dare you? How dare you? Send this inappropriate mailer to my innocent teenage daughter. There's no way she is pregnant. And
Oops.
she was actually dead. So it was a very contentious example.
Yeah. And how horrible for that girl, right?
Right.
I mean,
So,
to me, that's the data thing right there. That's just wow. But well, back to Mr. AI Goes to Washington. So there are different frameworks that have been suggested. The critical algorithmic system classification from Brookings, which is one of these think tanks that make their money in DC. That's protects civil rights. That's their take on it. Hugging Face CEO Clem DeLange is probably one of the few people that isn't running a 200 million person network of some sort that was there, said, basically that we have to encourage openness and disclosure as is appropriate. Well, when is appropriate and who's going to say when it's appropriate? So I think to me, what we're going to end up dealing with is basically a bunch of old men and some women in Washington that don't know shit from Shinola are going to just try to appease everybody. And what Silicon Valley will end up doing is using it as their excuse. We comply, and then it's on humans, and it's going to be about people making mistakes with AI, which I expect Elon to make 20 of. But
for every two that you make, Geoff,
that man. But what was really fascinating, though, I thought this week was the way the U.S. government's using AI, and these stories have been coming out now for a little while. Both the SEC and the IRS is using pattern recognition and financial transactions and tax audits to see where people may be fraudulent.
Yeah, I saw that article about the IRS, which was interesting, essentially using AI to identify patterns in, upper income returns. I'm not sure exactly what the language they used was, but then you're sitting there going, am I upper income?
How many gold toilets did they put it in the Trump?
Is AI coming for me, or is it, who's it coming for? The billionaires or me? Who knows? I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, it's definitely
hopefully you.
Definitely the top percent of the brackets are going to be seeing that, because those are often the more complex ones and the ones where they have businesses tied to it, I'm sure.
Right.
Which probably that's you and me, but
right. And I'm wondering, I'm not trying to advocate cheating on your taxes or anything like that, but
I know you got that clothing allowance.
Well, there is that. It's all these black T-shirts that I funnel through the business.
Yeah, your Versace T-shirts
as my uniform expenses. But it also creates this kind of to what, like, it's almost like an unfair advantage in a way. Like, it's one thing if it's me against a guy who's going through my return that's been selected through some algorithm, and he's got to figure out, did I follow the rules? Did I not follow the rules? Did I bend a rule? Is that problematic? Do they want to come after me? But now it's a machine with perfect recall of the tax code and access to every return ever, right? Who is now essentially the world's greatest tax expert, kind of flagging me and saying, it looks like maybe he put in for one too many meals last month, right? It's it creates this interesting dynamic that's exacerbates a dynamic that's interesting to begin with.
Or worse, you have an accountant that suddenly interprets a new tax code in a certain way and it triggers audits across his entire customer base.
Right,
with that
that's
one
another,
action.
Yeah, that's another thing too, right? I mean, it's not as if tax code is clear, easy, and understandable, even to great accountants.
And by the way, we're asking these same people that write the tax code to write our AI code.
Yeah. The other thing I wonder about getting out of this, because I feel like I just got us both into trouble and we're going to be seeing audits soon, is it's a good thing. Hopefully the third person who listens, it doesn't work for the IRS. But,
hey, I know a couple of those guys. They're right down they're my neighbors.
but more importantly, or a different topic really is, I wonder to what extent, when you have all of the biggest tech companies in the world sitting around the table helping to guide the perspective and then ultimately potentially the way AI gets regulated, how that potentially stifles competition. Because we've certainly heard part of the rhetoric from Silicon Valley is we need to regulate this in a way that allows us to innovate and still be fast and move fast and break things. But I don't see any of the small startups around the table. You could argue maybe a Hugging Face or a Cohere is a startup compared to a Microsoft or an OpenAI or a Google, but I don't see the 3-person shop that's aiming to compete with one of these tech giants sitting around the table, right?
And that's because of data. And if you think about it, the people that are at the table are the ones that have the data. They have all of it. Microsoft. Think about Microsoft. I mean, nobody really wants to think about this because we're all working. People that are listening to this are definitely more interested in a professional basis than somebody that's kind of geeking around with AI as a toy. And the reality is that Microsoft has LinkedIn. Microsoft has Teams. Microsoft has almost, I would say a likely majority of businesses across the world that are white collar using their systems.
Absolutely.
They have more data about the way B2B work is done than any other enterprise in the world. And they have probably billions of records of accounts of individuals and the way they act and the way they work. That's incredibly powerful for them to train AI on. And same with Google with their search and YouTube and all their products. I mean, obviously Meta. And these are the same companies that the EU is regulating because of the size of their data pools.
But here's the thing. The EU is regulating them because of those data pools. We're bringing them into the conversation about regulation, right? Which is a different thing. And
what would you like different than Europe?
Yeah, right? And like nobody, I don't expect that every Tom, Dick, and Harry startup with some seed money is going to get invited in to meet with the Senate, right?
I wasn't asked.
Right. I declined, but that's just me. That's how I am. But I'm thinking about.
I had money that McConnell was going to stall out again. Come on, man.
But I'm thinking about some of like the earlier rounds, like the Sam Altman regulate me roadshow, as I call it. When he went around to I'm going to go visit the 7 oldest men in the world and explain what AI is to them and get them really scared that AI is going to blow everything up. And then I'm going to, say, thank you very much. I can't do anything about it. Regulate me. And they'll have no idea what to do, but they'll be scared out of their brains, right? That was what he did. He went to Japan. He went to, I don't know where in Europe. During that entire process, there was that whole thing with the 6-month pause and the 3-month pause and the 28-word letter and all this other junk that was going around, which seemed to amount to, hey, look, if we're already as good as we are, we're cool. We can't get any better, but we need to stop other companies from getting to where we are. Like there seemed to be an undercurrent of that. Like, nothing, like, hey, we already have GPT-4, but we cannot allow anybody else to build a model as powerful as GPT-4 or it's going to be the end of the world.
Right.
Right.
Too late, Claude.
Right. So, so there's that.
We
too,
cannot
where
let
I
any
feel
more of
like-
my employees leave to create a model that's as powerful
Right.
as mine.
But like, I feel like there's a risk here where regulation that is heavily influenced by big tech creates potentially barriers that make it too onerous for any company that is not big tech to enter the game, scale, and actually compete.
And we've seen that before in other industries.
Sure.
Oil, for example, telecom. I mean, so the reality is that the competitive marketplace in the United States for tech companies is shockingly not competitive
Right.
when you consider how many big tech companies are actually in there. And the fact that OpenAI was able to break in so quickly with ChatGPT is the anomaly, the outlier, if you would, rather than the normality. It's a big deal. And what I really think that these larger tech companies want to do is create enough of an innovative environment that they can continue to do what they normally do, acquire companies to start up bubbling technologies that they find interesting and leading towards the future, but killing them before they get to be too big.
Right. And that's the risk. I mean, if you look at forget about the sort of the big picture and is this ethical and, capitalism, post-capitalism, blah, 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 blah. But think about even just some of the practicality. So today, the vast majority of digital advertising dollars goes to, some number of organizations you can count on, probably not even a full hand, right?
Right.
And in fact, I saw something today, a quick chart. I don't remember whose chart it was, eMarketer or somebody like that. eStatista, one of the companies that throws charts out on social media and stuff. And it showed how out of whack the amount of money that goes to Facebook advertising was 2-3 times greater than the amount of time people spend on Facebook. Right. And all this money goes to Facebook. It goes to Google and Google owned properties like Instagram and YouTube, right? All this digital advertising money goes there. Right. And so even in marketing, we are already shockingly over reliant upon a relatively small number of tech giants to get our messages out to the market.
Yeah.
And it appears that when it comes to AI, we're just putting even regulation aside, that we are willingly going along with a scenario that gives those very same tech companies even more sway over how people connect to their, each other, to content, to the internet, to whatever, and how we are then going to be able to connect with those people. And to me, it's like that dangerous concentration of power in just a few places.
Totally agree.
And that's true, I think, empirically, right? The extent to which, 4 billionaires hold the sway over the entire world. But even just looking and not getting like philosophical or anything, just looking at how much control Google and Facebook alone have over digital advertising and whether or not it's effective is shocking. I mean, I'm old, you're old. I started in an age when a media plan might have hundreds of properties on it. And when I got into digital, not only did it have hundreds of websites, but I had to pick them manually. I had to decide which 100 websites I got. There was no programmatic buying. And now everything is just like, throw it on the Google ad network.
Yeah, I totally agree. Right. I mean, it's shocking.
Yeah, and you're now starting to see some of these stories bubble up where advertisers starting to realize and researchers starting to look at and pick apart and say, well, a fairly substantial portion of the impressions that are getting delivered on these ad networks are junk impressions. And advertisers are up in arms, as they should be, but it's also a little bit of you reap what you sow. You didn't want to go through the effort of picking, your own 300 websites and negotiating individual placements. So you went to an ad network to buy effectively remnant, which turned out to be junk. Why are you surprised?
Yeah. The thing that's really shocking about a lot of it too, to me, is that the quality of data is shoddy. And 40% of it, if you think about the amount of Spanish speakers in the United States, is translated. So what that means is you get 40% of data that's being run through some automation in AI that instantly puts it in English and populates it in the database. Now that translator has bias incorporated into it. It inevitably does.
And inaccuracy.
100%. So 40% of all Facebook and Google data is shit. And by the way, I owe credit to that. That goes to my friends at Watering Hole AI who educated me on that. But I was like, wow, never really thought about that. But it's true. There are a lot of Spanish speakers in the United States, and their data is misrepresented right out of the gate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Powerful, right? Now just think about all the other inaccuracies that we're not catching.
Absolutely.
So, there's a lot of bad data and a lot of assumptions out there. It gets, again, back to who is regulating the data holders and what's preventing them from messing up their data and using it in an appropriate fashion.
Yeah. And, I feel like we're a little bit, we kind of came into this promising ourselves that we were going to do sort of a regulatory deep dive, but we're kind of a little bit all over the place. But I feel like
that's because we're not lawyers,
right? In a good way, because we're kind of hitting on like all these things that are kind of circling around, but they ultimately come back to the question of, are these things even being considered through a regulatory lens? And, so certainly all of this stuff that you're talking about in terms of bad data in, bad data out, but then you also get into, what if there's a malicious actor out there, right? Who's using AI, and we know AI can allow for, content creation at a speed and scale that is unprecedented. And of course, a lot of people are talking about, at least, the potential for misinformation, disinformation, so on and so forth. We have to, for example, of course, be prepared for like a tsunami sort of a disinformation shitscape around the election. And, knowing what we know about the past couple of elections, the Republicans are going to be far more skilled in employing artificial intelligence to flood the zone than the Democrats are going to be.
Maybe. I don't know. I don't know.
But it
seems to switch. Whoever's in power is bad at it. Whoever's out of power gets good at it. I don't know why.
I don't know. But regardless,
right.
Outside of a scenario like that, imagine somebody decides they've got a vendetta. This is almost like the Dell sucks.
We did see that with the Trump administration, where they were using algorithms to track conversations on Skype. Again, Microsoft, to see how people were talking about the president, and some people were getting outed and fired.
Yeah, absolutely right. But imagine, so you remember Dell Hell? One of the early social media.
God bless Richard Benhammer.
Right? Yeah, right. Where Geoff Jarvis had a problem. For anyone who isn't old enough or doesn't remember this, I feel like you're such grandpas. But
get off my lawn with your broken computer.
For anyone who doesn't remember this, the journalist Geoff Jarvis had some kind of a customer service issue with his Dell laptop, I believe, and he had an issue getting it repaired. And the issue, as he saw it, was he had a problem that he believed was within the warranty. Dell was giving him a runaround of some kind. I don't remember the exact details of exactly why he had beef with Dell, but it was a repair issue of some kind, and he felt like he was being taken for a ride, that they were violating their own warranty. So as a journalist, he did what journalists do. And of course, that's when everybody had their blog and people read blogs, is he wrote a post that was something like, the headline was like, Dell sucks, Dell lies, or Dell lies, Dell sucks, and something. And he told this whole story.
We all love those blogs.
and it created this firestorm where it got shared around a zillion times. It flooded the internet. Bloggers were blogging about his blog, thousands upon thousands, millions upon millions of impressions, and it became this dominant conversation about how bad Dell is. Not just their computers, but their customer service, the company. He really set them on fire. One of the earliest examples of a social media influencer lighting setting a brand on fire and just trashing it. And it took Dell quite a long time. You mentioned Richard Binhammer, who was one of the
Lionel Menchaca,
and Lionel were like the two kind of key social media people inside Dell who were fighting that fire. And it became a classic case study, both of like what happens if you don't treat your customers right, the perils of bad customer service in the age of social media, but then also for Lionel and Richard, a case study on how to actually address it and what
and listen and
what
change culture.
Exactly. Right. So anyway, that was the story then. Right. But now imagine that in the AI age, where you're not reliant on one loud voice and a bunch of humans to see it and pick it up. Imagine one bad actor saying, I don't know, Ford cars are riddled with recalls. And instantaneously, there's a million posts spread across the internet saying Ford cars are riddled with recalls, right? And now the next LLM comes through its training cycle. And anybody that prompts for like, what are good, what are the best U.S. auto manufacturers, right? And up in that response comes, well, here's what we do know. Ford cars are riddled with recalls, right?
Right.
How do you regulate against that, right? You've got how do you prevent that from happening? How do you catch that when it happens and make sure it doesn't become part of a training data set? Like all that stuff has to be thought through. And I don't know that anybody, maybe people smarter than you and I are, but I don't see Chuck Schumer or Mitch McConnell thinking that way. Because I don't think they have any.
I don't think they get it. They're too old. I mean, this is just a nightmare. These guys shouldn't be in government anymore. Anyway,
that's a separate thing.
Let's not go there. Do you feel like we've covered this regulation issue? I mean, as well as we can for non-experts?
I feel like we have, and I feel like if anything, hopefully it's been interesting. Certainly, again, it's not legal advice.
We just got more people hating on Washington. That's all we did.
Yeah, but here's the thing, right? And I guess I don't know to what extent this would be a brainer or a no-brainer or something in between. But if I'm going to call it,
half-brainer. Half-brain.
This is my half-brain.
I always knew you were a half-wit.
You give me too much credit by half.
Oh, well, you got better than mine. I'm just vapid.
So, I would say my half-brainer for today really is, I would encourage, if you're a marketer, like, put yourself through, as painful as it might have been to listen to, you need to put yourself through this kind of sort of reflective behavior, right? You don't have to have the conversation with your wife or your coworker or somebody sitting next to you on the train if, God forbid, you work for a company that requires you to go back to the office. But, when you see these stories about regulation, do think about, well, how is this playing out? Who's making the decision? Who's influencing the decision? How does this come back to impact the work that I'm doing as a marketer? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I believe it does.
All right, I'll add that. I'll try to come up with a full brainer. It's going to be hard. It's a challenge. Come on, man. That was your opportunity. I set you up. Anyway, all jokes aside, there's a lot of conversations within legal departments and large enterprises that have kind of corporate social responsibility and ethics DNA in their thinking. And this is where governance really does pay off, right? And I think that regardless of how regulation goes, you're going to see data protections in Europe. They've already been enacted. And now they're coming into effect over the next 6 to 7 months, in addition to the ones that just came into effect on the larger social networks, such as Meta can't pull together its WhatsApp data with its Facebook data with its Instagram data and whatever Threads is. But on top of that, California is probably going to put in its own privacy laws and data protections. Other states may follow California. Being in front of this from a we protect your data perspective as a brand, I think is going to be a differentiator, because there are going to be companies that won't do that. And the more you can do that, the more you can value people and honor their permission. People will give you permission, by the way, usually if you ask them, but honor their permission on marketing and using their data. I think it's going to really pay off and make you a stronger company. You need the best data you can in order to succeed in this new era. So you may as well start from the start.
That's a good one, my friend. That is much smarter sounding for a change than what I share usually. So kudos to you. That is absolutely, that was no-brainer gold right there. And I think it was just as true before artificial intelligence as it is with artificial intelligence, but it is all the more important now because there are so many more opportunities for the ways in which you use data to have more impact, both good and bad.
Yeah. And also, let's be honest. In the end, AI is human, right? AI is written by humans.
Right.
Its intent is for humans.
Mirror. We're holding a mirror up to ourselves.
Principled behavior always wins.
All right. Let's show our friends on out the door and call it quits for this episode.
All right. Hey, y'all. We're going to give you a special goodbye because we recorded on a Friday. Have a good week or weekend, depending on when you listen to this. And of course, give us a like if you enjoyed this episode. Give us feedback on the nobrainerpodcast.com site. Ratings and reviews are appreciated. And thank you for the Marketing Podcast Network for hosting us. Again, tell your friends about us, share it, and find us wherever you listen to podcasts.